everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two wonderful poets with us today. Aram Saroyan will be our first poet. Aram Saroyan's complete minimal poems, Ugly Duckling Press, 2002, made up of poems written and originally published during the 1960s and early 1970s, received the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America in 2008. Day and Night, Bellina's Poems, Black Sparrow Press, 1998, comprises poems written during the 1970s and early 1980s. Poems, Telegraph, 1972, collects longer, earlier poems written contemporaneously with those in complete minimal poems. An unpublished manuscript, Autumn, New Poems, collects work written since Day and Night. In recent years, he has worked primarily as an artist, and his work can be seen on Instagram and Saroyan-esque. Aram Saroyan has 5 of his minimalist poems etched into concrete walkways within Huchalinda Park in Pasadena, California. This was a commission done by the Los Angeles County Arts Commission. One poem is, quote, Incomprehensible Birds, end of quote. Another, on 3 separate lines, quote, Sky every day, end of quote. His poetry is joyful, fun, delightful, with a sense of wonder, rare in our time or in any time. I love his longer poems as well. One, Film Noir, is relentless, dramatic, and intoxicating. There's also a warmth and a humanity in Aram's writing. His art is freeing and astonishing. An innovative, brilliant poet, Aram Saroyan.
Thank you. And hi to Richard. And it's a pleasure to read with you. I'm going to read from this later manuscript, Autumn. And I kind of wander around in it. This first poem is called Ping-pong, and it's for my late wife, Galen. Playing ping-pong, trying not to win, but keep a rally going, a little marriage where winner or loser defaults the game equally. My sweet partner complying with whatever fate holds, keeping us in the game. Her. The woman who saved me at 7 or 8, taking me to ball games when my mother went under, a strange child in exile. You smiled the slightly sideways smile of that lady I knew to be kind. The pickpocket. The pickpocket delicately lifts a wallet from somebody inside coat pocket. The beat up door to his room half closed in sunlight. Money changes hands one thief to another, so the first thief can't be apprehended. Visited by a beautiful woman, he's oblivious, preoccupied, the idiot. Stealing a woman's purse, he puts a rolled up newspaper under her arm to replicate the push of her purse. I'm going to go back a little here. Today, I saw the sea as I glanced to my right at the wheel driving home from Oxnard, as if it were all one thing and alive. It there, me in the car, in my life, which will end as it continues, as the planet and the universe does. It had to do with being this age and being happy with life as a phenomenon, not abstract, but not so personal as it was. My wristwatch telling the same time as anybody's in this time zone. I got a glimpse of being alive and dead at the same time, the ocean and sky, a continuum in which I too, for the moment, exist. Rocks, for John Densmore. The secret of poetry is to write as if you are already dead, which may be why a poet is naturally drawn to rocks. They are alive, of course, but at an infinitesimal rate, so that a single breath takes a year or more. In the same way, a certain star sits in the heavens, although science has determined that was years ago. And what one is seeing has nothing to do with reality, but then so little does. This is a longer poem for the poet Alice Notley. Seeing you take the stage, slump-backed, belly forward in a no-nonsense green or beige dress, the very image of the lady poet of the ages, a latter-day Leonie or Louise or Marijane. I recall a winter day in '68 running into you at the Gotham Bookmark as you climbed from that cavern I was about to climb down into. A lithe young woman in black stocking, a look you had down pat too. I wouldn't have bet on you for the Los Angeles Times Poetry Award, but thought you were beautiful and mysterious, though a bit aloof, and wondered at you gone off with my older friend, Ted. That was 30 years ago, before this night when I meet your beautiful sister and her family, your husband, Doug Oliver, with your husband, Doug Oliver, your sons with Ted, Anselm, and Edmund grown up, and you emerged a late eminence. How proud Ted would be, how much he was eased by you, Alice, in the dark passage of the 15 years you gave him before he died in New York City on a scorching 4th of July. It was after that that you pulled up from your depths the story of a family no one could have guessed. From Needles, California, the national black madness going back to Vietnam and a brother's fate. It's the blink of an eye to traverse the 30 years, though they came slowly with their cargoes of pleasure and pain. Some people turn themselves inside out, surely a poet's chore to render the story time tells on the body we all are. And you are such a one, eyes so much fuller than when you use the black coal, little slits of mirth and grief. I greet you again, old friend, in the turn of the years, and thank you for the good faith of your climb from the cavern to the stage. A lot of these poems are death-oriented. Allen Ginsberg. The dead, the ones we loved, I think, civilized death, like an advance team to settle the place for our arrival. You and Ted, my father and Archie, his cousin, who handed me poems when I was young and didn't know what a poet was, what a price comes along with delight. Oh, sing a song then, the dead civilized death for us, suspended here in space and time, anxious to get on with our lives, hardly having time for such thoughts until, say, Alan gets taken across the threshold, that deep voice over the abyss of the 2 decades between us, and now this. Another one. Frank O'Hara shaving. He stands with the weight on one foot, bare-chested, his torso slightly tilted in the afternoon light of the loft on Lower Broadway. It's spring, a lovely day outside, April or May, and the rest of us in the room are sitting. Like a dancer, he stands, intermittently pulling the razor up his face, not worrying about the lather accumulating, and talks to us at the same time without the slightest suggestion of self-consciousness. It's 1964. I don't know, for instance, that Frank's going to die in 1966 in a freak beach taxi accident on Fire Island, that reality is full of dirty tricks and pockets of death and decimation. I'm 20. And watching him in front of me, the whole scene has an aspect of legend. He is holding court with the wit of a Balanchine valet, a veteran of the Navy before Harvard, coming of age as America turned into the big free world superpower. He won't live to see it decline, but Frank's not interested in power, but in love and art. Seeing him in art galleries uptown, I'm always a little nervous. Homosexual panic, feeling threatened by his ease, his grace, and the complexity of a moment I haven't got a handle on. I ask him for a poem for the magazine I start that fall. After he reads it at the party for Giuseppe Ungaretti, he and Joe Lesueur give at the loft that June, but he's not able to find it. Imagine losing a poem by Frank O'Hara. He does, and writes me a postcard. The handwriting is beautiful, fluent, graceful, and clear, but I don't read him for his deeper, denser music, so maybe the poem's not his greatest after all. Don't read him until later, that is. I do regret that time isn't always on one side, and that we can't know what Frank would have written if he'd lived to see Japan take Los Angeles and New York without a gun being fired. No matter, there he stands, bare-chested, 37 or 38 years old, a genius at life as well as art, already one of the witty immortals, shaving and talking to us, poised forever with the weight on one foot. Poem in memory of Wanda Coleman. The terrible pain, something irreversible living in you in minutest time, a form of madness, as if a dream blew apart, scattering parts across a wide horizon. You are dead. You are dead as the afternoon advances. Your old form, something not forgotten, but superseded by chaos, in which there is yet another design. Yes, you go on doing something, suddenly quite intent. Cigarettes. Remember the toasty taste of Winston's? White packaged L&Ms that possessed an almost mustardy edge, and Marlboro's straight ahead smoke? Those cigarettes had big personalities. Pall Malls were overrated. I smoked them with no real pleasure, perhaps distracted by the red package. The same could be said of Chesterfields, my dad's brand. Knowing Pop smoked them, I hoped perhaps to find an affinity. Camels knocked you back, and Lucky Strikes, forget about it. But it was all self-destruction. Bunch of poison we took in as if it were pleasure, listening to jazz and contemplating abstract expressionism. See what else we got here. I think I'm going to read this poem Harry mentioned, the long one, and then close with a very short one. Film noir. He was too excited to fall asleep. The little dog wouldn't stop barking. He took out his gun. He took out his handkerchief. He took out his notebook. He drank his coffee and left a dime. He walked into the room. He took her in his arms. She let him in and walked out of the room. He ran down the escalator. He left the motor running. He waited in the rain. He needed something to tell the police. He went down unconscious. The blood drained from his face. His eyes melted into a smile. He dialed and waited, looking around. He took off his hat in the elevator. He rang the doorbell and waited. He poured the cereal and added milk. He opened the refrigerator and looked in. He turned the page and continued reading. He shut the door and switched the light on. He looked up at a plane in the sky. He put 3 pennies, one on top of another. He squeezed onto the elevator. He took out his key. He helped her into her coat. He crossed the room and picked up the phone. He drove on through the heavy rain. He whistled for a cab. He turned the corner and bumped into her. She gradually surrendered to his kiss. He drove past the wrought iron gates. He lit a cigarette and waited. He lied to the police. He threw the dice and won. He folded the newspaper and crossed his legs. He sat down in the lobby. He tied his shoes and stood up. He put on his hat but didn't get up. He thought about her until he fell asleep. He said goodbye and hung up. He threw the dice and lost. He dialed and waited for her to answer. He left some money for her. He looked for her door number. The police arrived late. He walked into her building. He let her do the explaining. He gave up hope and begged. He locked his car and walked. She gave him that look of hers. He put a finger to his lips. He wiped his mouth and laughed. He slapped her across the face hard. He lit a cigarette in the dark. The police wouldn't understand. Her little dog slept. Her voice had an edge to it. Her hands were wonderful when she touched him. His mind might be playing tricks on him. The low hills reminded him of her. There was no way to cut his losses. He needed a shave and a haircut. The coffee did nothing for him. She was somewhere else when he called. Pain stabbed him as he reached toward the glove compartment. He needed a little time in the desert. He decided to head for the beach and then thought better. He needed about $5,000. He ran out of Lucky's and crumpled the pack. He left his hat on in the car. Maybe he was ready to die. He checked his wallet pocket. All of his friends had disappeared. He remembered her naked body. He had almost no savings. He was at least 10 pounds overweight. He realized he was in love with her. And I'm going to close with let me see now. I'm going to read a couple more here since we have a little time. Paris, 1. F. Scott Fitzgerald needed a mentor, which is how I fit into the picture. 2. Picasso was silent when I pointed out that Cubism was a misstep. 3. As a teenager, Gertrude Stein preferred the opera to theater. 4. Dora Maar was a beautiful woman who couldn't get over Picasso. 5. The apartment was the size of a postage stamp. We took it immediately and left after 36 days, breaking the lease to return to Kentucky. Jim Carroll. He walked around with a little piece of the sun, never quite certain what to do with it. TC. A string of bad luck hit you. You had a stroke, lost your job when the college collapsed. Angelica broke her hip. My God, we're old people now, not young poets leaving New York to head west. The planet rejiggering as we head to our grand, not so grand exits. My first friend, when we entered the fray, no one knows what's going to happen to anybody, Kerouac told us, closing his own book, The Red Letters of His Concentration. A milder, more domesticated lot, we could still spot the not quite all there, leading to calamitous reprisals in the papers. Who cares? With beautiful wives, we'd lead beautiful lives. And so we did for a while, taking our exemplars further into domesticity, our contribution, maybe. If you don't get your due, the ledger fills up anyway. We knew that too from Alan and Jack. The last two poems, two short ones. Nap. I fell down like a tree in the forest with no one there. Paradise. Look, the moon. Nuts look like wood, but taste good.
Thank you, Aram.
Thank you.
Thank you for your loving, elegiac, sagacious, and precise poems. We have 2 minutes left, and if I may, I would like to ask, when did you write your first poem, Aram?
It's funny. I actually do have a first poem, and I think I wrote it when I was around 10 or 11 in Pacific Palisades, when we lived there for a couple of years before my mother moved my sister and me to New York, because my parents had divorced. And it goes like this. The whistle of the wind and the crinkle of the trees made everything sound like the birds and the bees.
That's great. Well, we got 1 minute left. One last question. What is it? I mean, you write memoirs, you've written essays, you've written novels, you've written plays. What is it about poetry that attracts you to that form?
Well, initially it was that I was a very slow reader, and it was interesting to find something like a short poem that I could read, easily. And that attracted me. And then when I got into it, I was also looking for a clue about life, Louis Zukofsky defined poetry as that speech that speaks to all men, all women, or all everybody.
That's great. Well, I enjoyed all of your poetry you read today, especially the ones, all of them. And I love your camaraderie for your fellow poets. You've always been very caring for your fellow poets, just as Richard Modiano, our next poet, is. So thank you once again, Aram. You're fabulous.
Thank you, Harry.
Richard Modiano is a native of Los Angeles. He attended the University of Hawaii and New York University. While a resident of New York City, he became active in the literary community connected to the Poetry Project, where he came to know Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, Anne Waldman, William S. Burroughs, and Ted Berrigan. From 2010 to 2019, he served as Executive Director of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. In that time, he produced and curated hundreds of literary events. Richard is a rank and file member of the Industrial Workers of the World. In 2019, he was elected Vice President of the California State Poetry Society. In Richard Modiano's poem, quote, "On the Streets of the Lower East Side," end of quote, dedicated to Puma Pearl, he writes what could be his poetics, quote, "Fearless knowledge of our capacity to hurt, of our potential to love, of our creative generosity," end of quote. Richard has been generous, gracious in his poetry, work, spirit. His poetry is lyrical, clear-eyed, contains violent breakage at times. It's poignant, loving, elegiac, and compassionate. A superlative poet, Richard Modiano.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words, Harry. And Aram, that was a terrific set. I enjoyed every minute of it. It's a privilege to read with you.
Thank you.
Note to self. If you've never doubted the integrity of your superiors or their right to demand your obedience, nor felt the sting of wishing for something that could not be found on department store shelves or voting ballots, if you've never fallen so deeply in love that it seemed that you had been sleepwalking through life until that moment, never daydreamed desperately in a boardroom or on the job, never been carried away by extremities of emotion while everyone around you remained unmoved and oblivious, if you've never suspected that real life must be elsewhere, somewhere beyond the shopping malls and the suburbs, off the highway, over the fields and oceans, if there is no part of you unfulfilled by stock options and primetime programming and cutting-edge digital technology, then perhaps these poems are not for you. Comrade. I like to read and write in coffee shops, old habit, escape from noisy lodgings of bygone days. I share the place with the gentrified locals, fixated on glowing screens if alone, yakking about what's cool if with others, talking about dreams of screenplays and auditions with the eagerness of youthful promise. They pay me no mind, the old fellow in threadbare clothes, scribbling in a pocket notebook with a fountain pen. The young barista, pierced, braided, tattooed, took the money and handed me a coffee. As we made the exchange, I said cheerily, "Thanks, comrade." Leaning in and glancing side to side conspiratorially, the barista whispered back, "How did you know I was a communist?" Home for Dennis Cruz, inspired by The Beast Is We. I saw a black tarantula crawling out from under the flower pots. Have you ever seen one? They are not spiders. They are black and furry and beautiful because when ugliness and wickedness are as deep as existence, when they come down from eternity, they have a perfection of their own. I watched this beast and I said to myself, how beautiful you can be with your long strangler's paws, your fine corset of dusky velvet, your furry belly, your fabulous jaws. It was when a big drop of poison fell. That's how you were born. And you lived because you are perfect. But I'm going to take my revenge, you filthy insect. I've known too many victims and I have a debt to pay. And just imagine, the tarantula understood me. He was paralyzed, befuddled by his destiny. He looked around stupidly for a way out, but for him, there was no way. My eyes hypnotized him. I was so sure he wouldn't go away that I went into the kitchen for the hammer. It gave me pleasure to swing the hammer on the black beast, and I laughed as though I had one drink too many. I crushed the velvet tarantula with one blow, crack. That's what you've got to do from time to time in this world, or the air would be unbreathable. In 2005, I went with a peace delegation to Japan. It was the 60th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Peace Plaza, Hiroshima, Japan, August 6, 2005. The time, 10 minutes past 8 in the morning. In exactly 5 minutes, a bell will toll to mark the moment when the atomic bomb exploded here. 8:10, and it's already 90 degrees. 5 minutes from now and 60 years ago, it was 10,000 degrees in Peace Plaza, ground zero, the hypocenter. And here I sit in a folding chair with 500 other people on this spot, 1,500 feet beneath the detonation point, looking at the empty rostrum. Past the dais, I can see the iconic A-bomb rack building left standing, and the white cenotaph where scores of unknown bodies reduced to ashes lay. To the right of the dais sit the big shots, Koizumi, the Prime Minister of Japan, government officials from Europe, Russia, even from the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Korea, victims of Japan's aggression. Where are the Americans? Sitting with the rank and file, all as peacenik, Buddhists, Methodists, Quakers. No official acknowledgement from the U.S. government, maybe for the best. The bell is tolling, 8:15 a.m. The sun's exploding. Forbidden lunchbox. Displayed here in the Hiroshima Peace Museum, but not allowed by the U.S. Congress to be shown to the U.S. public, 1995 Smithsonian Institute. Small rectangular metal lunchbox, charred food visible, said to be a mixture of rice, barley, and soybeans. The box looks remarkably clean, scoured by atomic fire, a little battered, but otherwise, once fitted with a new lid, usable. It belonged to Shigeru Oreman, a first-year student at 2nd Hiroshima Prefectural Junior High School. He was exposed to the bomb at his building demolition worksite 600 meters from the hypocenter. Every day with his classmates, he was mobilized to help with the demolition of buildings for fire lanes. On August 6th, as usual, taking the lunch his mother had prepared, he left home early in the morning. After the A-bomb fell, his mother wandered through the ruins of Hiroshima looking for him. Early in the morning of August 9th, on the bank of the Honkawa River, she found Shigeru's body with this lunchbox held tight under his stomach. The lunch Shigeru never ate was charred black. By order of Congress, no victims allowed. Nazo Nazo, a bar in Hiroshima. A girl bar with red neon called Riddle. The young woman took a seat on the bar stool next to me. Nihongo wa daijoubu? She asked me. Hey, daijoubu yo. A blast of cool air chilled the sweat on my face and carried her scent. She smelled good, but I noticed the mama-san behind the bar. Why did she name the bar Riddle? The mama-san answers, it sounds exotic and it seems to pose a question about life. She was 8 when the bomb killed her mother and sister. She still carries scars from the blast that slashed her body. Go underground. After the defeat of the Paris Commune, Arthur Rimbaud, a 17-year-old poet protagonist, said the blood of its victims drained away all hope for his generation. For a long time to come, Rimbaud said, truth will have to go underground. It had been reduced to tatters along with life. Once again, truth has similarly been reduced to tatters along with life. To trace out any hope of its recovery, poets need to organize underground and follow old mole of old, agitate underground, assemble in low-rent storefronts, in sunken basements, maybe in communal squats, somewhere cheap, somewhere far away, or perhaps close by. Begin again, build up again. Truth today is more truthful in the underground than in the commercial overground or in the nonprofit overground. Truth will not be voiced from the rich core, but from the honest poor periphery, from the margins of life, from the margins of our cities, from its grungy peripheral banlieues, from broken down informal zones defended to the end. There, nothing will be truer than nothingness, the source of a new radical beginning. Poem for Zoe Tamerlis. Zoe Tamerlis was an actress who I knew on the Lower East Side. She was also a poet, and she was associated with a lot of avant-garde activity back in those days. But her most famous role was the protagonist in Ms. 45. So, Poem for Zoe Tamerlis. Cats leap across my heart when I see your full red lips, and the glassy water breaks with white sparks, scattering your words in all directions. Zoe, your crowned scalp with inky black hair, a halo of dawn over the urban river's skyline. Tonight you see through my words, Zoe of twilight ruby, and I sleep through your breath, Zoe of black leather. I dream through your tattooed arms, Zoe of a desert where the hawks turn blue, and I walk in your palm of Mount Meru, Zoe of obsidian in the coup d'etat, and I'm lost in your solar breasts, the flares made fertile, Zoe in the night of honeysuckle, Zoe of crystal palace, Zoe of Mongolian steppes covered with gold krugerrans, Zoe of boots under a red brick tenement where the anarchists are plotting our liberation, Zoe of dolphin spume, Zoe of lava made helium, Zoe. A word, Poem for Iris Berry. You have to select a word. It will be talked about as little as possible and have a deep suggestiveness like nature, bloom within itself. At the edge of the fate encircling you, it will become darkly and sweetly ripened. Of 100 experiences, it always will be the sum total of only one. One teardrop becomes the harvest of all teardrops. A single point of red neon on Hollywood Boulevard on a dark evening is the light of the whole world. And after that, your poem, like a substance entirely fresh, released far away from your memory, the same as a chord plucked from a Stratocaster, the same as haze over the San Fernando Valley in spring, will suddenly begin to sing from its own recollection. Excuse me while I move the cat. Poem for Puma Pearl. On the streets of the Lower East Side. Your patience, thank you. Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story. On the streets of the Lower East Side, fearless knowledge appeared, like a natural angel at the bottom of her heart. On the streets of the Lower East Side, fearless knowledge sought her with searchlights shining up to the bottom of her heart. On the streets of the Lower East Side, fearless knowledge of the night and what it does to you filled her soul with the stunning brilliance. On the streets of the Lower East Side, fearless knowledge exhaled in her words with the force of a truth gale that blew us away. Fearless knowledge, her life raft for that January grief. Fearless knowledge, brought from insomnia, turned into art. The pictures take themselves. Fearless knowledge of our capacity to hurt, of our potential to love, of our creative generosity. Fearless knowledge, Puma's knowledge, shared with us our knowledge, fearless knowledge. And let's see. I don't know. I think that's all I picked out, Harry. I didn't want to go over too much.
Well, let's just talk for a little while.
Okay.
Well, I find your poetry vibrant, empathetic, compassionate, loving, and it's always specific, which is always good. You know, Blake said generalities are idiots and particulars are geniuses. So I always like specifics in poems, and I like, on the Lower East Side. I mean, Aram probably knows more about that. I visited a few times, but there were a lot of great poets that congregated in that area. And one question before I ask you the poetry questions, what was it that engendered your love for Japan?
Well, it's when I was living in New York City in the 70s and 80s, I worked at the Art Students League, and I met some Japanese students that were there, and they were artists, and we talked, and they said, we have a tremendous poetic tradition in Japan that is about 1,500 years old, and you should check it out. So I did, and they told me more about Japan, and I wanted to visit. And eventually I was able to visit. I got a job teaching English as a second language there, and I met some of the people who I knew at the league had gone back to Japan, and they showed me around. I liked the courtesy. I liked the poetry, the painting, both the traditional and the modern. Most people know more about traditional Japanese art than they do about contemporary Japanese art, but it's just as vital. It's harder to access though, but it's nonetheless just as vital.
I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked Aram. When did you write your first poem?
Well, it was probably an assignment when I was in the 5th grade or 6th grade. I don't remember it. I mean, I did what they told me to do so that I could get a passing mark, but actually I didn't really connect to it until I was a teenager. And that is when, it was through, thank God for public education, because that is a way of, at least in the United States, of connecting with culture. Now, because it's presented in a particular context, it may turn some people off, but that was not my experience when it came to poetry. So I liked the American master, starting with Edgar Allan Poe, which is very easy to get into, and Poe and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and then into the 20th century and into the modernists, and particularly into the beat lineage that can trace itself back to imagism and objectivism, on all of the poets that work in that and draw on after that beat lineage. Like Aram, for example, is a great poet in that tremendous lineage. So my connection with poetry was that it is probably the earliest form of literature. I mean, it was memorized and chanted before it was written down, but it has this long history that goes along right with the human race. And I think that we could reasonably hypothesize that even before we have traces of civilization in the Neolithic, and before there was poetry, there had to be.
You know, I saw W.S. Merwin at the LA Central Library, and the first thing he said when he got up there was, he said, I, along with many linguists, believe the first utterance of language was in poetry, and it came out of grief. Now, nobody knows for sure, but it was probably some cry out, some sound. You mentioned Edgar Allan Poe. Obviously, you know that he influenced the symbolists, and Baudelaire, translated or wrote essays on him, and then, a phrase like the sick hospital by one of the symbolists, was important to people like Eliot and all that, all the suggestion as opposed to direct treatment. Another question is, what is it that attracts you to poetry? Maybe you answered it in your last.
Well, what attracts me to poetry is that it's open. Fiction, everything is pretty much spelled out, and the author is leading you along to make his or her points, to create a world or bring you into contact with a particular character or person, and you follow those cues. And poetry is more open. You can pre-associate off of poetry, however specific it is, and it sort of resonates. It resonates with your own experiences. And I think the best poetry is what addresses our common humanity through our own particular experience of the world and other people.
All three of us, deep interest and work in poetry, and we also love film. And you got a grad degree, I believe, in theory of film. Is that correct, at NYU?
Yes, cinema studies. Yeah.
Aram has always had a deep interest also. I don't know how to ask a question about that, but could we just...
Can I put in a plug?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't discover it, but I just saw it again, and it's become my favorite movie, favorite American movie of fairly recent vintage, The Fabulous Baker Boys.
Oh, yes. That's a good
Oh, my God.
Good choice.
So much fun because it's the American songbook, and David Grusin is, scored it. And it just runs all the way through the film. And then the performances are just amazing. And Michelle Pfeiffer is unbelievably funny and great throughout the whole, and beautiful through the whole thing. So anyway, if you feel like having an up evening, I recommend it.
I remember her entrance in the film, as she auditioned.
Oh, yes.
I also remember that scene where she's lying. She's wearing a red dress, and she lies down on the piano and sings a song. But the bridges were both good. A very beautiful film. I love that film too.
She broke her shoe when she's coming in an hour and a half late for the audition, and she swears, and they don't. Beau Bridges doesn't want to even allow her to audition, and she somehow convinces them, and they've had, as they put it, 37 auditions, and none of them can carry a tune. And she sings more than you know, and it's actually her voice doing it. And she isn't a great singer, but boy, that song has never sounded better.
Where did that take place? Did that take place in Seattle?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think it did.
Yeah.
What about you, Richard? What's one or two of your films that you love?
Well, there's so many. It would be hard to pick a few. I mean, one that I saw recently was a documentary about James Baldwin. I Am Not Your Negro.
Yeah.
Really excellent. Yeah. It's really excellent. Yeah. The director of that was a Haitian filmmaker. His name is Raul Peck, and he has directed a series of programs called Exterminate All the Beasts that's now playing on home box office. And I haven't seen it, unfortunately, but if it's as good as I Am Not Your Negro, it's worth checking out. I also heard that he intends to make a movie about John Brown, which should also be interesting.
I love James Baldwin. He was a prince, and I saw him on a talk show one time, and he said something like, the black is in the white, and the white is in the black.
Mm-hmm.
He had that sense. That kind of alienated him from the black nationalists.
Mm-hmm.
I loved his, passionate. He's a poet. He was. I remember when Frank Orsero, before he got replaced by Burgess Meredith, was directing Blues for Mr. Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
Produced by Actor Studio. And he said one time in the acting class I was in, he said that James Baldwin is as good a poet as Tennessee Williams, and he really was a wonderful writer.
Yeah. So one favorite movie that I will mention that I also saw recently is History is Made at Night, which is a film by Frank Borzaghi. And it is, I think it's from 1938, and it is one of the most deliriously romantic movies imaginable. I mean, just the title, History is Made at Night, gives you a taste of what the whole movie is.
Made of Light? History is made of life or light?
History is made at night.
At night? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
History is made at night.
I got to check that out.
Since this is a poetry show, I realize that let's just talk a minute, too, about both of your influences in poetry. Let's start with Aram. Aram, years ago, you were reading at Idlewild with my late wife, Holly, and I remember at night, we had a dinner at some woman's home, and you told me that Ted Berrigan was very important to you. But who were some of the poets that were influential to you as a poet?
Well, initially, I was very taken with, how I mentioned I had I was a very slow reader, and I was very attracted to Robert Creeley. First, his poems were very short, but then beyond that, I couldn't understand them. So it was sort of a challenging situation, and that got me started. The thing about Ted was he read everybody, and he was very open-minded. And I was I considered myself a Black Mountain poet, really serious and, like many of the poets I really admired. And I met him, and he said, I expected him not to like my poems, but he said, no, man, I liked them. He said, but, my friends and I, we like to tell a few lies in our poems, a few jokes. And I think you'd be good at that, too. It was like it opened up a whole new vista. It was very liberating. And also, I love the way his poems are very musical. Like the Sonnets is a very musical poem if you just get into the sounds of it. So he was kind of ice cream on the apple pie.
Richard?
Well, Ted also, I mean, when I met Ted, I dare not show him anything that I had written because I didn't think it was all that good. But just he said, "Have you read this guy? Have you read that?" I said, "No, I haven't. Read them." It was just as Aram had said. He read everything, and it wasn't like he threw everything into some kind of slot. He was very discriminating. And when he recommended something, it was something that was worthwhile, that would expand your understanding. Even some of the stuff I didn't get right away, but I went back to it, and indeed it did make sense to me. But I would have to say that probably the first poet that was an influence on me was Bob Dylan. When I was a teenager, I remember, I forget which album it was, but he had printed the lyrics of the songs on the back of that album. He didn't do it on other ones, but on that particular one he did, and I read that. And in the course of my own independent reading here and there, I saw that there were people that had influenced Bob Dylan, namely Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. And there were people that they had recognized. And so it sort of opened this big door. And eventually I was reading all sorts of poets from not just the 20th century, but from the 19th century, not just in English, but in French, though in translation, and in Spanish, also in translation. And of course, it took me to Rex Roth, and Rex Roth had translated from the Chinese and from the Japanese. So yeah, it was like all those people. I mean, it's the weight of that whole lineage is sort of was my influence, I guess you could say, and still is.
It's funny. People talk, well, is Bob Dylan a real poet? And I'm sure part of it is the fact that he wrote songs, but I know more lines by Dylan by heart than any other poet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
Yeah,
one of my favorite lines of his is, "He who's not busy being born is busy dying." Here's Jennifer Clymer, who makes all these shows happen for 14, 15 months.
Can you believe
what would you like to say, Jennifer?
I wanted to pipe in here, and I know you guys should know we have plenty of time. We're going to do another round of Dunk Tank. The show that normally would have been at 2:00 got canceled for today. So I love the fact that the conversation can go on. But Harry can tell you, I fancy myself a little bit of a singer. And I think that the power of lyrics sometimes gets lost in the beauty of the music, where lyrics are music. Lyrics are part of that power. So I'm so glad for you to say, yeah, these are lines that I quote even more readily. There's two different parts of the brain that work in Congress when music and lyrics are joined together. And I love that. I love that it's math and creativity and emotional expression.
You're a fabulous singer. I love your singing. Jennifer sings with a group, is it Harvard?
The Harvard Yardbirds.
The a cappella. And they sang, they did a show here, which was just fantastic. They sang Dodger opening, Star Spangled Banner at the hockey games, etc. A lot of shows, but she sang on our show a few times, and I always love hearing her sing.
Yeah, it is my joy. Whenever I am honored to be asked, I am more honored to bring the music. And I'm flattered that I sang at a hockey game. The group sang for the LA Lakers. And more recently, we put together a couple of music videos for some political action groups. There's a Harvard group called Crimson Goes Blue, and they're very active for the blue side of the political spectrum. So we'll sing for anybody, though. We would go Crimson Goes even more deep red if you need us to.
Well, we can talk some more. Aram, you mentioned Ted Berrigan, but I'm sure there are other poets in the past besides, he and Bob Dylan. So let's just talk a little bit more. You mentioned Bob Creeley. So, 1966, when I got turned on to poetry, I was, old by many standards. I was 26 years old before I began to really, write and read poetry and learn the tradition, which I'm still learning. But For Love was one of the first books that I read. And a neighbor, I was living on 25th and 10th Street in a 5-floor walk-up, 3.5 room bathtub in the kitchen for $51 a month in 1966. And my neighbor was Mike Paveo, who turned out to be a hard-edge painter. He studied with Hans Hofmann, I believe it was, Barnett Newman at the Art Students League. And he was going with Bette Midler at the time. We all worked together in a club downtown at 1 Sheridan Square. It was called the Downtown. It was where Cafe Society used to be. And she was a dancer. And we would sit next to each other and read out loud either Whalen or Blackburn or Creeley to each other and laugh at some of the poems they would write and all the breaking of conventions, that we were used to academic poetry that we were taught in school. So who are a couple of your poet influences that above and beyond Ted Berrigan and Bob Dylan? I mean, I'm not saying Bob Dylan was an influence, but just, in poetry, for example.
Well, Phil Whalen was tremendous and still is. The amazing thing about Phil, I was talking to another friend who began to write poetry, but I remember began to write prose after being a poet. I remember in 67, like the spring of 1967, suddenly Phil Whalen, who was a distant friend, I had corresponded with him. I'd never met him. I mean, he was in San Francisco, living on the East Coast. But suddenly this novel appears. You Didn't Even Try. And it was like a novel about the San Francisco bohemian intellectual artistic scene. It was like Jane Austen in San Francisco in the 1960s. And I was enthralled because it was really wonderful prose. And I remember Ted saying at the time, wow, what? And, he and Richard Brautigan, who was also a poet, who would write prose, So those were two big influences. I love Brautigan's work as a prose writer first.
That one line in Whalen, something like, at least I broke that twig and gave it to you in love, something like that in the poem.
Yes.
See,
Yeah.
My wife and I used to quote that to each other. And then there was a little short poem of his called Diamond Sutra.
Oh, yes, yes.
Guy gets out of jail, and what happened to that diamond I had you keep for me? I can't remember the exact lines. And then On Bear's Head was just fabulous. But I always felt that he and Snyder and a couple others, they were up on mountaintops, and the rest of us were in a valley, and they were communicating their great thoughts in their mind to each other.
Yeah.
I always loved his sense of humor, and he was fabulous. What about you, Richard?
Well, I have to mention Charles Bukowski. The very first poetry reading I ever went to was a reading by Bukowski. And I was, I think, 16 at the time, or 17. And there was a bookstore near where we lived called the Dialogue Bookshop. It was across the street from Valley Community College. And they had a bulletin board there that listed all kinds of local events, be-ins, love-ins, and poetry readings. And I had two friends who were brothers, and the older brother had a car. And I said, listen, you want to go to this poetry reading? And they said, yeah, let's go to this poetry reading. It was on a Sunday afternoon at private residence in Silver Lake. And I think it was John Thomas's residence, as a matter of fact. And I knew who Bukowski was because I had read his column, Notes of a Dirty Old Man, in the Free Press. And I knew that he was a poet because I had read some of his poetry that was for sale in that very bookstore. And this was, I believe, before he was published by Black Sparrow, or just maybe at the beginning of it. I didn't know what he looked like. So we went to the poetry reading, and there was a guy sitting on the floor leaning against the wall, and he had a reel-to-reel Webcor tape recorder next to him. And from a brown bag, he was drinking Brew 102, which was a very cheap Los Angeles beer, $1.50 a six-pack. So a couple of poets read, and then the host said, and our next reader is Charles Bukowski. The guy sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, pushed a button on the tape recorder and listened to Bukowski's pre-recorded poems while through the reading he just... And after the reading was over, I went up to him and I said, Mr. Bukowski, what do you have to know to be a good poet? Kid, you have to know how to drive all the horses at once.
Well, you wrote a poem about that, I believe.
I wrote a memoir of that. I wrote a memoir of that meeting, yeah.
That's great. Well, you know, I knew his wife, or it wasn't his wife, but the mother of his child.
Oh, yes, Francine.
You probably knew her too. And they were together 5 years. And I asked her one time, you know, her name used to be Frances Dean Smith, and she changed it to Franci. But I asked her one time in the Beyond Broke workshop, I said, what did you learn from Bukowski? And she said, he taught me that I was half a devil. I was half an angel and half a devil, you know, so I remember one time I got up to read at a small press, you know, fair, let's call it, at the Ocean Park Church. And the woman who introduced her called her a poetess. And Frances just read her the riot act. I'm no poetess, I'm a poet. I'm with all the men too, I'm a poet, you know, but she just really told her that. But, you know, you both have a rich history. I mean, Aram goes back, his father. I remember one book of yours. I might have been your dad's book, but it was, or yours. I think it was your dad's, maybe, about when you and your sister spent a month with him in Paris, or was that your book?
No, well, he wrote a book called Not Dying while we spent that month with him.
I think that's
and that was a memorable time. We spent a couple of times like that, once in London in 1966. He was by then a sort of, you know, entrenched bachelor. But he would every so often, I mean, he rented an apartment in Chelsea, a one bedroom. And Lucy, this was the summer of 66, was camped out in the living room. And she wrote me a letter and said, hey, why don't you come over? It's really fun over here. You know, it was modern rocker London. And so I went over there. We had a great time. It was, we were kind of too old to be kids, but he did some late inning parenting. He was quite charming in his sort of Lion and Winter phase. But it was a memorable time.
I remember one, I don't know if it was the same one you're talking about, but I remember a scene that I believe you described, maybe it was him, but I think it was you, where you were all together that time you're talking about, and your father was eating a peach on a corner in Paris or London, maybe it was, but it's just how beautiful it seemed, you know, and the enjoyment of all that. But he was, you know, he was important to many of us, you know. He was so, the short stories, I remember there was a short story he wrote. It was only about 3 pages long, and it was about a Filipino guy, I can't forget the name of it, and he was hounded in a line, these people getting aboard a ship or a boat, and there was a drunk Marine behind him, kept pushing him and just kept hounding him. And then the guy kept following him, and everybody could see what was going on. And then finally the guy follows him around the ship or boat, whatever it was, and he goes in. Your father goes, not your father, but the character in the story goes into a men's room, and he shuts the commode door, and the guy breaks through the door, and the guy stabs him with a knife. And then as they're taking him away, he says, "Why didn't somebody stop him?" But it was just this, your father. I remember somebody once asked him a question about Henry Miller, and he said, "Oh, he's the guy who goes on and on." I mean, your father really knew how to tell a story.
Well, it's funny because in 1940, it's 3 years before I was born, he wrote that, what some people think, and me included, is maybe his best collection of stories, called My Name is Aram.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I mean, he invented that genre of multicultural American lit with that book. I mean, there are people I know who gave their kids the name Aram, not having anything to do with Armenians, but just loving that book, which is just a delight. I don't know. He did some dumb things at the end of his life, like turning his estate over to some people who had no business running it. But, I think his reputation is solid, because a book like that is going to be around,
Well, I remember I asked you to go to the Academy one time to see a movie called, I believe it was The Promise. It was about a story in genocide.
Terrific.
And Oscar Isaac, one of the few films made about that. I wish there were more, but I remember at the end of
I think that was the first that really addressed it. Adam McGoyan did something, but it wasn't really. I thought The Promise was terrific. Did you like it?
I loved it. And I remember at the end of when the credits are coming down, there were a few lines of prose, and Aram read it, and he said, "Dad," and then William Saroyan, those lines by William Saroyan. I don't know if it was those famous lines about you get two or three Armenians together is enough to make a civilization, or you got a civilization.
Yeah. He those lines are on little posters and placards throughout the Armenian community. In his day, like the Depression and a little beyond that, he was probably the most famous Armenian of that period, which was a terrible time for Armenians, and they looked to him, and he was an amazing guy. Now I realize how lucky I was to know him. At the time, it had its ups and downs.
Those
could also be impossible, and so.
I see in your writing, obviously it's in your blood, but then also, what I also see in your, minimalist poems or conceptual art, your poems, conceptual poems, that you're also an inventor. You have these marvelous perceptions of, like your one poem, Crickets. I don't know how many times you say that, like 50 times maybe.
Well, it depends on how many lines there are on a particular page. That's funny because Richard mentioned Barnett Newman, and the inspiration for that poem, where the column of crickets is on the right side, was at least partly Barnett Newman's zip paintings, where he has that column running down.
Now, you mentioned something, Richard, that's always fascinating to me, the IWW. When did you get involved with that, and what is your your philosophy that comes out of that? I know you're always deeply compassionate and empathetic about the other, so to speak, and you've always cared deeply for the working class, and you're not you're really you always have a sense of equality and you're against injustice. But how did you first get started up with the IWW?
Well, I actually first heard about the IWW in a book by Jack Kerouac called The Dharma Bus. And the hero of the novel, Jaffe Rider, who's based on Gary Snyder, was in the IWW. And in the novel, Kerouac says a few words about the IWW, and that gave me an interest in it. I actually read this when I was in high school. Then when I was living in New York City, one night I came up out of the subway, I think it was on 6th Avenue and 8th Street, and there was members of the IWW had set up a card table and were giving out literature. And I went over and I said, the IWW is still around. I said, yes, it certainly is. And they gave me a brochure that had the address of the office, which at that time was at 119 East 10th Street, a couple of doors down from St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, where the Poetry Project was located. So I went to a meeting, and at the meeting there was among other people, there was a guy by the name of Steve Ben Israel, who was a member of the Living Theater. And I learned that the Living Theater was a job collector of the IWW. So I thought, if it's good enough for the Living Theater, it's good enough for me. Sign me up. And of course, the IWW had the Little Red Songbook. And they published in their newspaper, The Industrial Worker, they always published poetry. So they were always open to poetry, and we're not talking about the quality of the poetry, but the fact that they would publish it in their newspaper spoke well of them to me. So I joined the IWW rather than the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Socialist Workers' Party, or something that was way too doctrinaire, too narrow, and too officious for me. But the IWW, it stood for the working class, for working people. And at the same time, it regarded artists as people who worked. Making art is work. It's a job of work. And it recognized that. So that's why I joined the IWW.
And they're the Wobblies, right? They were known as the Wobblies. Yeah. I remember my dad mentioning him. A writer named Jim Tully, who I think was part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We both of you have mentioned, in either directly or indirectly, St. Mark's Church. And as I mentioned earlier, I got turned on to poetry in 1966, and I started going to St. Mark's Church. And I remember they had two readings I would go to, one on Tuesday and Wednesday. One was open reading and one was, featured reading. So I heard Jackson McLeod, Joel Oppenheimer, Blackburn, etc., Greeley. And that was really an education for me. And I've often thought that Beyond Baroque, which is here in LA for 50 years, it's the best poetry center, west of St. Mark's Church. But I always loved St. Mark's Church. And you both mentioned Ted Berrigan. And I remember that year I saw on the ad, probably on the EVO or, Voice, that Ted Berrigan was doing a benefit for C Press, capital C. So I went down there on a Saturday, late morning, and he was sitting behind a table, and there were a few people around, and that was the first time I saw him. I never knew him, but just to kind of digress, I think that I love Alice Notley. She's, I love, personally, I love Alice Notley more than I love Ted Berrigan, even though they're both great. But she just really knocks me out. I mean, she's just such a unique thing. And I love that poem you read about her and, her back, origin in needles and then, her rise. But she's a fabulous writer, too.
You know what she's doing now, which is quite amazing. I'm on Instagram, so I see her latest work is a combination of words and drawings, color markers. they're just, and they're bringing out a book. I think it's about to come out of these works, and they're very charming. I love her work. Really terrific.
And I would be amiss if I didn't ask you this question, Aram, because one last question, if I may, Jennifer.
Of course.
Aram got famous in the early mid 60s, and he wrote a poem, a one-word poem called Lighghght, if I remember correctly. And they actually argued about your poem in the halls of Congress. So could you just talk a few minutes about your poem and the conception of that and what that led to, Aram?
Well, it's funny because I had, it involves Ted again, and this is such a great example of his sensibility. I used to go to the Metro Coffee House, which is right around the corner from St. Mark's Church, on Wednesday nights, because that's when we would read our poetry before the St. Mark's started up. And Ted was a friend and a kind of a mentor, because I was about my very early 20s and he was maybe 30. Anyway, one night I would bring in some poems and just show them to him and see what he said about them. And one night I had a sheet of paper, and just on the middle of the page was just in lowercase EYEYE. And Ted was shuffling through the pages, and he came across this page, and he said, "What the fuck is this?" And I thought, oh, that's a great response from him. And I think about a year later, I wrote the other one, Light, which basically adds a GH. And I mean, you know, it's interesting now because on Instagram, people have done tattoos with that poem or one of the, one-word poems. I think it was the 60s. And one line I have about it is, the light got a little heavier.
Well, that's great. I don't know if Jennifer, I saw Jennifer there a minute ago. I know it's 2:25, and
I've been I love every moment of this. This has been fantastic. I had no idea that your one-word poem got debated in the halls of Congress. That's spectacular. Let them debate. I'm interested in, Harry, what was your first poem?
Yeah. You know, the first poem, as I mentioned, when I was 26, and I went down to visit my brother who was living with his wife in Washington, D.C. And it was after I read the New American Poetry, 1945, 1960, Grove Press with Ginsberg, Snyder, etc. And I met on the way back on the Greyhound, there was a man sitting next to me, and he was an old guy. He used to be a hobo. And he told me about, for all the time from Washington, D.C. to New York, about his travels around America and his dog. And so I got home and I wrote a poem called His Dog. It was the first poem I ever wrote, and it's one of my better poems. And I didn't take any quote, but I remember, talking about the rails that he rode and the dog, you could touch the dog, but don't touch the man. And what he fed the dog, frijoles. And it was just really, it just had a nice fall to it. And it just came out of the blue after this experience. And that was the first one. And I read it at St. Mark's Church, along with two other poems at my first public reading, open reading. And Paul Blackburn came up to me and told me he loved the poem. So, just a little, some people like to criticize people and be negative, but I always find it's better to, tell people what's good about their work. And just from that very beginning, I realized, boy, here's a guy, I've read his poetry, The Cities, which is one of my favorite books, Grove Press, I don't know what year it came out, 60 maybe, but I always loved his poetry. and he was an urban troubadour. So that was my first poem, and that's the story, and I'm sticking to it.
So indulge me for one more hairy question, because you guys may have insight into this, but the few years that I've had the pleasure to know you, I am struck by the incredible detail that you go into, that you know the publisher, you quickly access names and quotes and time frames. And I know from what I've heard you describe in terms of your own process for your art, for your acting, the detail that you go into is extraordinary. Is that something you've always had as part of your life? Were you a kid that was like, oh, it's a toaster, I'm going to take it apart and figure out every nuance of it? Like, where does that come from?
Well, my mechanical ability is zero, but I was always good at English. And, it's just what we do every day if you're a poet. And as I mentioned earlier, whether you're an actor or a poet, if you're an actor, you have to be specific. If you're a poet, you have to be particular. I mean, some people like to generalize, but it's best to be specific. And we just read these books over and over, The Cities, Grove Press, 1960, Paul Blackburn.
I love that book. Also, Richard remembered the address on the Wabu.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I can't remember next door.
My wife and I, just talking to digress, we used to always talk about poetry from morning to night, 4 a.m. to, she'd get up at 5:30, I get up at 4 when she woke up until we went to bed at night, year after year. But we used to say poetry is not, it's a non-commercial art form, and we live in the most commercial city in America. We used to say we're the mutants of our society because we do our work, and but it's just something, in math, we used to, as a kid, I'd go to different schools and have, math contests or spelling. And by the time I drew the line after, a number of, this many lines of numbers, I had that right column figured out. So I told that, went to the second one right away. But I think it just comes from being a poet and being specific. I think it's really that simple. We have to be specific, but I want to just say, thank you, Jennifer. You're always so comforting and knowledgeable, and you're caring. And I just want to say to these two poets, thank you very much for your camaraderie, and you nourished me, with your love of poetry and your work in poetry and your caring for others. And you mentioned communism. This place is not communist. It's a capitalistic society here at MPTF, but it is caring. Everybody here is treated the same, and we're treating so caringly by the people who work here. Jennifer, Bob Beecher, all of the staff, and it's really a pleasure to be here and being taken care of and cared so well by all the people here. So I'm grateful to live here, and I'm grateful that we have this show. Thanks to Jennifer, and thank you. My last words I'll say are thank you, Aram and Richard and Jennifer.
Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Thanks very much.